We're back with Conversations with Great Minds. Tonight, I'm joined by journalist and author Hartmann Summers. Anthony, one of the first books that you were quite famous for was one of the first really good, thoughtful, thorough books on the assassination of John F. Kennedy, recently reissued under the title of Not in Your Lifetime in 1998. The House Select Committee on Assassinations reported that to quote the committee believes on the basis of the available evidence that President John F. Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy, end of quote.
Probably.
In your mind and based on your research, what was that?
Well, what an unfortunate, a fascinating reversal of the Warren Commission report, which said that Lee Harvey Oswald, on his own, shot President Kennedy. And then here comes, years later, here comes a congressional committee that concludes that President Kennedy was probably killed as a result of conspiracy. For a historian, that's truly unsatisfactory. But it was a major move forward. They concluded, by the way, at the same time that Martin Luther King had definitely been killed as a result of a conspiracy. I tried to avoid the Kennedy assassination for years. I was then working for the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, and I thought that a reporter's reputation would go down the plug hole, disappear without trace, if he messed around with the Kennedy assassination. I think with good reason, because after all, those of us who were around then sat through the Jim Garrison circus in New Orleans, which was a tragedy of a prosecution, because it was right in New Orleans that Lee Harvey Oswald had been until not long before the assassination. Vital events occurred in and around New Orleans, and yet the waters were completely muddied by that risible investigation and prosecution, which failed. The guys he charged were found not guilty. I did get involved, however, at that stage when the congressional investigation began in the late 70s. And I did do a documentary which was shown on the BBC and around this country. And I was astounded. I would go to see witnesses and I would say to them, I'm sorry to be here bothering you, because I'm sure that in the past you were interviewed by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and of course the FBI and the agencies. And time after time, I would find people that if they didn't throw me down the stairs, they would say to me, "Oh, come in, Mr. Summers. Nobody's ever talked to us." And I realized that, to the shame of the US media, no two journalists, or Woodward and Bernsteins, if you like, of 1963, had ever been told by their editor, "You're on this story and you're on it. If it takes 2-3 years, you're on the story until you're off it." And the fact was that the reporters of the United States had looked into the, if you like, the panoply, the tragedy of the affair, the funeral, and all the momentous issues involved in the death of a president, but they hadn't investigated the case. No one had been there being what I think a decent media has to be, being a flea on the back of the rhinoceros that is government. And when I emerged from making the documentary, I then thought, I've got so much left over, and I'd worn out so much shoe leather talking to witnesses on the ground, and I do have something to say. So I wrote a book.
Yeah, and a brilliant one it was. Another book that you wrote, Official and Confidential, The Secret Life of J. Edgar Hoover. Was it well known at the time that you began the investigation that Hoover was gay, and that basically the mob had been blackmailing him, or was this something that you broke? And how did you? Let me just let you riff on that.
Yes. Well, with respect to him being gay, I have to say, it wouldn't have mattered, although it would have mattered in his day. The historical fact that the man was not heterosexual is not in itself necessarily a terrible thing. And there was that rumor around him not least because he never married, and because he effectively, although not precisely, lived with his close aide, Clyde Tolson, for many, many years, who, when Hoover died, became effectively like his widow. They went everywhere, spent all the time together. Clyde Tolson rose meteorically from a humble agent to become assistant director of the FBI in very short order, 2 or 3 years. So it looked as though they were gay. But I think it did become significant, as you rightly point out, when I put together the facts about J. Edgar Hoover's aversion to pursuing the mafia in the United States with the fact, which I find compelling, that the mafia knew about his sexuality and used it as a lever to make sure that that the FBI did not pursue organized crime at the very time that it was right on the rise and could have been squashed. So that by the time the FBI did get serious about organized crime, which was during the Kennedy administration, it had reached a peak and was enormously powerful, so that it couldn't be squashed at all, and it took a long time, years later, before one could say that organized crime was even more or less beaten.
Mm-hmm. You write about J. Edgar Hoover influencing the course of World War II by ignoring a warning about Pearl Harbor.
Yes, and I'm glad you hit on that, because I think that was a real manifestation of a man who had by that time gained so much power and deluded himself about his judgment about people and the extent of his power. A man called Dushko Popov, a brilliant agent who worked for the British, concluded and reported to his British intelligence masters that the Japanese were likely to attack, and that they were likely to attack a major American harbor, and he concluded Pearl Harbor. He brought that information to New York. The British thought it was so important that they sent him in person across the Atlantic to carry the warning to the FBI. And Hoover had him watched for a couple of weeks. And this guy was a womanizer, famous womanizer. I mean, he was a real Lothario, and flash with it, and like wining and dining and living very well. Mm-hmm. And I mean, a true sort of James Bond. And Hoover didn't like that at all. He said that he was a real decadent, dissolute figure, which he really wasn't. I know a great deal about him now, because I know his family and have still spent time with them. But he was also a damn good agent. And the tragedy of it is that, and who knows how much it affected what actually happened, but the tragedy and the evidence is that when the information that Popov brought to the United States was digested and analyzed and sent to the White House, the element about Pearl Harbor was omitted.
Because of Hoover's opinion of this fellow. That's
well, I wasn't there, and we can. I wasn't there, and we can only surmise. But yeah, it's significant that the most important thing that Popov came to say, and that the British wanted him to say. Yeah. And I've talked to his controllers and the people for whom he worked in British intelligence as well before they died, and they were just devastated when Pearl Harbor occurred in the way that it did occur, and caught the United States napping.
Yeah. J. Edgar Hoover also, according to your writing, used his knowledge of John Kennedy's womanizing to ensure that Lyndon Johnson became vice president. He relied on dirty tricks to stay in office under Kennedy, and subverted the Warren Commission's probe into the investigation of his death. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think you have it generally right. On a TV program, one can't talk about it too closely. I think the last of the elements of what you just said are the most important, that in a sense he did subvert the Warren Commission, but It's a bigger thing than that. You know, people dwelled, when I wrote that book, all the media dwelt, surprise, surprise, on his sexuality. And the more flowery bits that I reported about that from first-hand conversations with people in most cases. But it was the way he abused the system, that abused the democracy, that it is most disturbing, the way in which he would effectively have his agents as spies in the US Senate and in the Congress. The way in which, and I talked to some people who had personal experience of this, the way in which he would send one of his assistants to the Hill and have a conversation with a senator in which he just said, in the course of things, the aide would put a document on the desk or just remark that one knew that the said senator had been caught or stopped while drink driving with a woman, not his wife, beside him. Little things like that, peccadillos.
So he was basically
and just say, well, I want, yes, effectively.
Yeah.
I mean, it would never be expressed as blackmail. Don't misunderstand me. It would simply be, you know, I just want you to let you know that the director knows this. We know about this, but don't you worry.
Yeah.
And of course, the congressman or the senator in question knew that did have to worry.
Quite remarkable. We just have a little over a minute left, Anthony Summers. In your book, Goddess, The Secret Lives of Marilyn Monroe, I thought one of the most fascinating aspects of this was all the confusion around the nature and death of Marilyn Monroe. Was there a cover-up?
In short, yes, I think clearly there was a cover-up, which doesn't mean there was a cover-up of her death, nor does it necessarily mean that there's anything sinister going on, that she was murdered. What is clear, though, is that her relationship with JFK and her relationship of some sort of intimacy, although it's not clear that it was a full-fledged affair, her relationship with Robert Kennedy, who was Attorney General at the time, there was a great rush, and you can see why, with an election looming for a second term in August '62. That was certainly covered up.
Remarkable. Anthony Summers, thank you so very much for being with us tonight.